Back in 1954, when you both began the work of L'Abri, what was the basic motivation for what you did then?
There was a desire in Mother's and my mind to demonstrate that God existed. So we called the children into Charlie Bijou in the living room there, and it was unanimous that we would step out to tell God that we knew he was there in such a way that we could trust him. We would start in that chalet of Chalet Les Malaises, with you with polio, 2 girls with rheumatic fever, looking to the Lord only for financial needs, that we would step out without a plan.
Divine providence seems to have fixed up everything just before it happened. In other words, you didn't die of polio. We weren't actually, we were able to stay in Switzerland when we were put out. The avalanches did not demolish our house. All the things that happened.
Where both of my parents had a real struggle was that they were both interested in art, science, literature, humanistic endeavors, race relations, all these things, but they were part of an evangelical tribe that was not. And the way they balanced it was by trying to do both. The funny thing is when people say, oh, well, you've departed a long way from your parents, actually I followed their path in terms of art, philosophy, and interest in these things to the letter. Where I've left is in thinking that you can be both an evangelical Christian and a reasonable human being.
What in the end, then, is the answer to the monstrous inhumanities which humanism has produced in our culture?
The real Christian ought to come out and he ought to say, this whole thing is truth that I have in the totality of Christianity, and what you have is a complete lie, a complete falsehood, and meet it on every front simultaneously.
I do not much believe in the ecumenical movement. I think most of it's a lot of hot air. The only thing the ecumenical movement in the 60s did for Catholicism was to infiltrate it with the rot of liberal Protestantism.
And on After 8 this morning, our subject is book banning.
The traditional Christian view has been relegated to a subculture.
You can't get your books in the libraries, and you can't get them in the bookstores?
Right, particularly books from a traditional Orthodox Christian point of view.
Getting to our heavenly home, the wrong markings are put there by people who say that you just got here by chance. Just lots of little electrons, lots of little particles zooping themselves together by chance through all the centuries and centuries of time. Does it make sense? Doesn't make sense, does it? The wrong markings will lead you to a precipice, and you're surrounded by wrong markings.
My mom came out of an evangelical missionary background. Her parents were 19th century missionaries in China with the China Inland Mission. Okay, so I grew up on stories of miracles in the Gobi Desert, angels showing up to feed missionaries, rescue children, stuff, sort of an entire mythology of belief. Anything that would happen that would be coincidental that you could ascribe to God's leading or a satanic attack you did. So Mother and Dad would have believed in a literal devil, all the rest of it. This was my childhood. So in terms of the neural pathways of my brain, I'm wired that way. There's no getting away from it.
What do you think about the idea of the separation of church and state, as it's often used today, to stop Christians from involvement in politics, law, and other fields where they could be confronting the world in which they live?
Is absolutely inane. I can't say any stronger. It is not rooted in history. It is not a reality on the basis of the history of this nation. And it is also stupid.
My lens for looking at my dad's claims about the separation of church and state, if your faith informs your views, then you're not doing anything unusual in American history. But in terms of the fudging the line, prayer in schools, not teaching evolution, all this kind of stuff, obviously I'm totally on the other side of the issue. In other words, at that point, Dad was just talking as a straight-up right-wing evangelical. And, those people consider me as their enemies, and they're right, because I am.
Yeah, well, I'm just assuming it's like a TV audience. I don't assume they know anything about it.
That's right.
I mean, I'm not famous.
That's really where
so I got to sell who I am.
That's right.
Frank Schaeffer, author, political commentator,
/ political commentator, Crazy for God. Frank Schaeffer / political commentator, author of Crazy for God. First thing I'd say about my office studio is that I built it. So what I first did in this room is built it. There was nothing here. There was a woodshed, and there's a couple of beams around that still show from that. I stripped it all down to the wood, and took the roof off, and built the room. Jeannie and I moved into this house in 1980. We've been here 32 years, and I've done a building project every summer, so we fixed it up as we could afford it. And that comes out of growing up in Switzerland, by the way, where I was homeschooled and didn't really get any real education at all, was just allowed to hang around the village, and who I hung around with was the carpenters and the masons. So, you know, I can mix up concrete, cast it, you know, I know how to use rebar and all the rest of it, and it's part of my life I love. So what you're looking at is one of my little building projects here. And I paint what I grow in my garden, I paint what I see out my window at the marsh of the Merrimack River. I play with my grandchildren. Lucy has a corner over there with clay and crayons. I play with my grandson Jack. We have what we call Bach and crackers. Jack sits on my shoulders and we march around in here, and he eats boxes of wheat thin crackers while we listen to Bach, and he's done that since he could sit up there. So that's what I do in this room. And then I also write books like this one, Crazy for God, which I wrote sitting here, and you know, half a dozen other books. I do my blogging for Huffington Post here. I was one of their first bloggers. Arianna Huffington got in touch with me when she was opening up and asked me to be a blogger. Probably answer 30 to 40, 50 emails a day, because I tend to write to everybody who writes to me. So that's what I do here.
So when my mother would say a long grace at a table in an Italian restaurant and everybody's looking, who are these weird people? I wanted to fall through the earth. You know, there's a little English girl at the table looking at me, and I know she's going to say, why are you all so weird? I was very aware. So essentially my entire youth and teenage years was spent trying to find some way to be normal. Even from a very young age, I was intensely uncomfortable with that. Witnessing, evangelism, the whole bit. When I got into the religious right myself as a leader and was flying around in Jerry Falwell's jet and all this crap, you know, at that point, the question of are these people flakes, is this true, is answered, because you're with people like Falwell and Robertson who are one thing in public, totally different with their own staff and so forth. And the sad thing for me is that my parents were so much better than this. They were real. They weren't money grubbing. Dad's book sales went back into his ministry. They were the genuine article. So for me, you know, I think this will sound odd, but part of the passage out of evangelicalism for me is I was raised in a genuine evangelical home. So Mom and Dad really were two people. They were the people who ran a ministry that was open to gay people, welcoming to black people, in a racist, homophobic environment of American evangelicalism that they left in 1947. I mean, that's way early to say the hell with this. And they got out and did something different. But then on the other hand, when it came to theology, you were talking to different people. So if you, for instance, asked Dad about his scriptural view of homosexuality, you would get one answer. Francis Schaeffer had gay couples staying in his house and never told them they couldn't share a room. And we're talking in the 50s and 60s. Francis Schaeffer had black people in his ministry when the racist evangelical majority would have been shocked. Francis Schaeffer was doing interracial marriages in the 50s and told his own daughters they could marry black men if they wanted to. My heresy, in terms of temperament and actual life choices, I'm still far closer to he is than the religious right people who think he was their person. They just never were at L'Abri in '68 while hippies were shooting up in the woods, and other Christians would come in and say, why aren't you throwing them out? And he says, why would I throw these people out? Well, are drugs allowed in L'Abri? No, we don't encourage it, but they're precisely the people I want to help. So there was the theology on one hand, and then there was the way they treated people. There was the theology on one hand, then there was the interest in culture. Mom and Dad never put that together. They would not make that choice saying, okay, I've got to change my mind. They tried to keep it all going at once, and I think it's impossible to do that, and I went in a very different direction.
I kind of was like Rip Van Winkle. I left this evangelical right-wing movement about 30 years ago.
Well, stud, it's your lucky day.
And I wrote many books, 4 novels and nonfiction about my son being in the Marine Corps, all sorts of subjects.
Some fathers would be thrilled to have a son in uniform, but not the father you're about to meet.
I come from the Vietnam generation, and to me, being in the Marine Corps is body bags and coffins and all the rest of it. And so, my worry was very immediate and very real, and that is Marines get killed.
And finally, in my 50s, I came back to the fact that okay, it's time to write a memoir. So I wrote this book called Crazy for God, and I'd sort of been, out of the evangelical mix, not much contact anymore, because if you get out, you're sort of cut off. So I didn't know what the reaction would be. I was writing it for folks who read my books, people who read novels, literary types, et cetera, et cetera. But what stunned me was that the email ran literally, I'm not making this up, about 100 to 1 positive when it came from evangelicals. They were saying, well, you've told our story. Your journey out of right-wing Christianity is the same story we have been following. And so I find that there's a big current through the former evangelical groups now, sometimes generational, but sometimes not. Men and women my age who have just had enough of the hate and enough of the reaction and have left, that still longs for a genuine spiritual connectedness and community. It still has a love for the gospel, Christianity, and yet at the same time has utterly rejected this right-wing course, or is at least feeling very antsy and nervous about it and glad when someone like me comes along with that past who has spoken up and left it. And since that reaction happened, I got interested again in speaking in Christian communities.
Welcome to Revolution. We are a community of grace and provocation. Today, we have a special treat. We have our friend Frank Schaeffer in town, and he is going to be in conversation with Jay Baker.
So nice to see you all. Oh, hi, Tammy Faye.
Hi, Tim Baker.
Mom, we skipped school just to say happy birthday.
It's Tammy, Sue, and Jamie Charles. Come on out.
Now, my parents were pretty big, which I was thinking was funny is that they never joined up with the Falwell guy. Well, I mean, Falwell eventually just really did a number on my family. Yeah. But, my dad was never a joiner, so he never really joined up with the Christian right. I was listening to an interview with you, and you're talking about going to see Reagan, and my dad has pictures with Reagan and George Bush Sr. and all that stuff. It's just funny how the evangelicals were like all in the White House at that time.
We used to leave our own graffiti in the bathroom, but it was like, Jim and Tammy were here. No, Frank was here.
My dad was going to buy me a black suit and take me to the White House one day. That never happened. 1987 happened. My parents had a scandal. A few years later, my dad went to prison. The church split. The church wasn't there. I saw the disloyalty of the church.
Jay and I have totally, our own paths and stories, but in terms of mine, I kind of grew away from the idea that somehow I would have to inherit this mantle in a nepotistic sort of North Korean government style where because you're Kim Il whatever, then you've got to be the next Kim Il something else. If you had been an evangelical in the 1960s and the 1970s and certainly by the 1980s, you would know who Francis Schaeffer was. You'd know who my mom, Edith Schaeffer, was. They were both prolific authors. When my dad died in '84, it was just a choice saying, I don't care how much money's here. My marriage is no good because of this. I'm not a good father. I'm slapping my daughter. I'm furious all the time. Basically, I hate this world. How did I get into this? And it wasn't so much theology. It was just this. I was on a collision course with myself because I'm an artist, I'm a writer. I had to discover all that, but at the time I knew that whatever this is, it isn't me, and I don't care what the paycheck is. So I got out for kind of, you might say, aesthetic reasons, and then they developed into more political, theological ones later. I just couldn't stand the environment anymore, and I bailed. And paid a heavy price financially because the big bucks were in the God business. And later, it went through the political changes that put me on HuffPost and all this other stuff now, as opposed to where I was then. But I didn't start out with some big, the hell with this, I'm out of here, I disagree. It was just, I can't take this anymore. I would just say the rise of evangelicalism had several parts. First of all, if you go back to the 1920s, it's the reaction of fundamentalist Christians in places like Princeton Seminary against what they would regard as liberal theology that was being imported from Europe, from, for instance, the German theologians who were involved in what was called higher critical thinking and so on. People like Gresham Machen in Princeton in the 1920s and before were taking, quote, a stand against them, saying they're giving up their view of Scripture. And they left denominations, they left seminaries, and or like Machen were kicked out. And certain people followed them into the wilderness and established their own Bible churches, free churches, independent churches, new denominations, derivative of the Presbyterian movement, for instance, which had many, many different denominations come out of it. In fact, in my novel, Portofino, which is a work of humor, my first novel that's sold well to a lot of people who know nothing about Christianity, folks are always amused because the church that this family belongs to in Portofino keeps dividing, and they start off as the PCUSA, the Presbyterian Church USA, and then it's the PCC USA and the PCCC USA, and they keep adding to the initials as they get smaller and smaller. And in the end, in the novel, it boils down to one family, and a couple of followers. And there are people who really have gone through those things in many, many churches where they just split and divide. Nobody's ever quite pure enough. And that's the evangelical disease. In other words, once you're hooked on the idea that salvation is not by grace, but by correct ideology, so you have to formulate it correctly or you're not in, then in individual communities, maybe your pastor is not correct enough, and so you split and you go with the youth pastor and form an even more correct church, and then he's not correct enough, and so now you just are down to a Bible study group being correctly led somewhere with the right interpretation. So it's a very divisive idea that salvation is through correct theology of belief. The traditional evangelical movement, as it morphed in the 1970s into a political movement, came out of the fights in the 1920s primarily between what were the emerging quote-unquote liberal denominations that became the mainstream denominations and those that adhered to a more fundamentalist, literalist interpretation of the Scripture. So it was a dividing of the ways, a parting of company. Fast forward up until the 1950s and 60s, you had the emergence of people like Billy Graham with his crusades, calling people to accept Jesus as their Savior, a kind of a formulaic statement of what it meant to become a Christian and how to become a Christian.
You may be living in a fool's paradise. You may think that you're a Christian, but you're not. I'm going to ask you to come out of your seats from all over this great building, from up in the balconies, all around. You come and stand quietly right here in front and say tonight, I give myself to Christ.
Fast forward a little more and you get into the 1970s, Roe v. Wade, the part that my family, the Schaeffer family, played in the rise of the religious right, along with Schaeffer Koop, who then became Ronald Reagan's Surgeon General.
Consider the unborn baby. In January 1973, the United States Supreme Court passed the abortion decision, known as the Roe versus Wade ruling. Upon this arbitrary ruling, medically and judicially, the Supreme Court invalidated the abortion laws of almost every state in the Union.
Who once knew better words, now only use four-letter words, writing prose. Anything goes. When every night the set that's smart is intruding at nudist parties in studios. Anything goes.
And all of a sudden, this fundamentalist reaction against liberalism takes on a new tone, and that is it's political. And now there's a whole group within the evangelical movement that are more interested in how you vote, say, for Republican candidates who are anti-abortion, anti-homosexual, as they would have put it, and so forth, than just you accepting Jesus.
How much consideration are you going to give to the advice of these new conservative organizations and the moral majority and people like the Reverend Jerry Falwell?
I am going to be open to these people. I'm not going to separate myself from the people who elected us and sent us there.
We appreciate your vision, Mr. President. A Christian man with a vision of a world of freedom and democracy. A man who believes in a commitment to family values. who believes that adoption is a better idea than abortion. We appreciate that.
A Christian Manifesto was the title of a book Dad did, a small book, short, like 80 pages. And it was a declaration on the political issues of the day, namely abortion. That America had passed a line of no return. It was essentially in the camp of Nazi Germany. And whatever was licit and allowed to do and to stop the Nazis, Christians would be allowed to do if they failed in what Dad called the political or the electoral process. So actually, Dad was calling for armed insurrection in a very direct way, simply saying, well, it's not now, but if everything else fails and we can't reverse Roe v. Wade, we're in the same place as we were in Hitler's Germany.
Loyalty to the Lord Jesus. We must absolutely set out to smash the lie of the new and novel concept of the separation of religion from the state, which now most people hold, and which Christians have just bought a bill of goods.
Some people got that message. Clinics were bombed, people were shot, so we actually saw people murdered as a result. And there's no question that they had been influenced by what we were doing. It was a disaster. I mean, essentially, it was like a teenager who threatens something and then it actually happens. So I think my father was shocked because Dad was a very nonviolent person. He was surprised and horrified and basically, I think, had underestimated the power of the words into that kind of angry environment.
The paradigm of lost and saved, you've accepted Jesus so you're saved or you haven't, was applied to politics. You're either for us or against us. There's no middle ground. And since politics is the art of compromise, obviously applying an evangelical saved and lost model to American politics made it very unforgiving, very uncompromising, and you get that same heated sort of sense of us and them, those who are for us and against us in a political environment. What happened, therefore, was that you got all the energy and the anger of the religious right drawing its inspiration from an idea that somehow not only was the rest of the human race lost, but if they weren't voting on our issues our way, they weren't really even Christians, quote, real Christians. So Sarah Palin, for instance, would talk during her time of being vice presidential candidate about real Americans like us being her, and everybody else. And of course, that's very much the language of the evangelical movement when it comes to Christianity. Real Christians, i.e. those who have accepted Jesus in an evangelical way, accept the Bible as not just normative and instructional, but literally true, and everyone else, and even if they claim to be Christians, for instance, liberal Christians from mainstream denominations, they are not real Christians, just like if they vote wrong, they are not real Americans. So I'd just say in a nutshell, the rise of the evangelical right comes out of a certainty about theological things that is then applied to political things, and you have an absolutely obdurate, unbending, no compromise, line in the sand that cannot be crossed. So they see themselves as both victims of attack from not real Christians, not real Americans, and holding on somehow when it's in politics wrapped in the flag, and when it's in religion wrapped in a literal interpretation of the Bible, as if somehow they're making a last stand for real Christians, real Americans. That kind of, to me, describes the difference between mainline Christianity, which is more inclusive and welcoming, and the evangelical form, which is very exclusivist, and after the 1970s, not just about who Jesus is or what the Bible is, but about what America is and who are real Americans, even real patriots, and so forth and so on. And it's that line in the sand mentality which has marked the whole movement. There's a real dilemma here because your evangelical neighbor living down the street is probably the most kind person on your block, and if your child needs a place to go after school, that's who you want them with. But in terms of how they vote, if I can use a simplistic analogy, they are the people that will prevent you from getting universal health care for folks, because they have decided the federal government is evil, because the federal government allows abortion or homosexual marriage or whatever it would be as they would think of it. And so therefore, whether it's building infrastructure or Amtrak or national health care or regulating Wall Street, they have bought into a corporate right-wing line which defends the interests of people very much not like them, the corporate titans of this world on Wall Street, and so have been used. So one of my reactions to the evangelical movement is actually one of great sorrow, because here you have people who started out trying to spread the love of Jesus by getting people to accept Jesus and get their sins forgiven. This gets politicized in many, many ways. Roe v. Wade, prayer in schools, integration, because there's a racist element too, not in all evangelical homes by any means. When you put all that into the mix, this has been a group that has been, I think, in my opinion, bad for America, because it has retarded the social safety net and meant that we could not really care for people the way folks have been cared for in more secular countries, say in many instances in Europe. So it's crazy, because the nicest people you will meet in your life, somehow the most compassionate and even sometimes educated and well-read people, interested. You go into their house, they're playing Bach's B minor Mass, you know. Those are evangelicals too. But taken as a group and how they vote, it's been disastrous. So it's almost like some crazy species, which, you know, when taken individually in the water, you know, is a very nice little fish and swims around your feet. But when 500 of them show up, they eat you alive. Then evangelicals have become literally vicious. Taken as a group, they have pushed the country toward a right-wing, paranoid xenophobia about the world. And that dilemma, that paradox, is one of the great unanswered questions of American history right now.
People say, oh, well, what do you believe about this? Or even about my father, you know, who was this evangelical intellectual. What did he believe about this and so on? I always say, well, it depends on what day you asked him, but also what period of his life. You know, the fundamentalist who went to Europe as a missionary in the late 1940s, the intellectual to hippies, you know, with Jimmy Page running around with one of his paperbacks in his back pocket, or the religious right leader in Jerry Falwell's Jack going from seminar to seminar, like sort of the party line, like we've got to vote for Republicans.
There's about us on every side, and especially the government, and especially the courts, have become the vehicle to force this anti-God view on the total population. It's exactly where we are.
Well, there are some things I'm absolutely certain of. I'm very certain that I love my children and grandchildren, that what I think is beautiful probably is, in some sense, that is, I mean, this is a weird way to describe beauty, but absolute. So I think clean water is more beautiful than filthy water that kills people. But when it comes to philosophical certainties and absolutes, I would describe myself as a Christian atheist.
Being an atheist on days when I don't believe anything, when I am cast in despair and doubt and depression, are not days when I'm closer or further from the truth, because on the days I believe, I'm believing wrong anyway. How do I know that? Because I don't know anything about God. I love Hitchens and Dawkins and these other guys, just like I love Jerry Falwell and my father and everybody else. You know, we stand up out of the slime. 10 seconds later, we're making cosmological statements about the universe and everything in it. Are you fucking kidding me? I can't even find anywhere I'm going without a Garmin. And you want me to tell you whether God exists? Give me a break.
One thing that my writing has cured me of in terms of the email traffic I get is any idea that non-belief certainty is any smarter than belief certainty. Because having published a book with a title that says Why I'm an Atheist Who Believes in God, I'm getting all kinds of shit from atheists who say, you're not a real atheist. And I actually read their subject lines and they sound so fundamentalist that I think I'm just getting my usual traffic of crap from fundamentalist Christians. My mother, at her most fundamentalist, Calvinistic, Bible verse a day, all the rest of it, was no more blinkered than the correspondence that I get from people who have attacked faith as completely moronic. So don't feel threatened by these folks. They have nothing to offer you except another package of false certainty. I actually had a little email correspondence with Christopher Hitchens before he died, who had read a book of mine, a memoir, Crazy for God, and he liked it. And he emailed me saying, and then I finished this book, I'm so disappointed, why didn't you become one of us? In other words, he was waiting for my conversion moment, and it doesn't occur because I remain someone of faith, struggling but nevertheless.
People say, well, aren't you holding on to your faith sure and sure? Well, look, I've also been married for 42 years to the same woman. I have 3 kids and 4 grandchildren. There are days I'm married, and there are days I'm not married. There are days I love my wife. There are days I fight with my wife. There are days when I am glad for what we've had over the years. There are days when I think, gee whiz, you know, I met this girl when I was 17. You know, what's this? What's happened to my whole life here? So if someone says, are you married? I would say, yeah, married, kind of, but I'm sort of a married atheist. And there are days when the marriage is very, very good. And obviously more days than that otherwise. And so what I don't understand is why, when it comes to theological questions, certainty is given a premium when nothing else in life works that way.
So why can't you be an atheist some days and love God other days? And the only reason I can think of is if you believe in hell based on people who would be sent there if they don't believe right. And what really changed my thinking on that was my own grandchildren. I was a bad father, a 17-year-old, 18-year-old father slapping his little girl. And if I could go back, I'd literally cut my hands off because I'm so angry with whoever that asshole was. I don't know him anymore. It's 40 plus years ago, okay? But I can remember what he did. And then I look at the reaction with my little 4-year-old granddaughter Lucy, or my grandson Jack, or even my teenage grandchildren Amanda and Ben. And the level of patience I have. And I haven't become a good person. I've just simply gone through an arc of learning and experience. And so I look at that arc of learning and experience and I say, well, if you take the evangelical model of salvation, first of all, it's based on you're saved if you have correct ideas. So basically, let me be God for a minute, and Lucy's my creation. She isn't, she's John and Becky's creation. They wouldn't like that, but she's my granddaughter. There is nothing in the world that this little girl could do that would make me burn her for eternity. So she can get my birthday wrong, not believe in me anymore, think she has 4 fathers, think that the Trinity has 4 people in it, that I'm not the Son of God, that everything, because she can screw up all the facts about me. Do you think that would change one jot of how I feel about this beautiful little girl? She looks up in my face and says, I love you, Ba. She doesn't even call me by the right name. I'm grandfather or Frank or something, and she says, Ba. Where does that come from? That sounds like Baal. Is she worshiping the golden calf? But what I'm trying to say is, now how would it turn out that God is meaner and stupider than me? And that in an arc of a mere 40-year passage with children, I can learn not to slap little girls, but instead to be patient, so that when she almost set the house on fire the other day with a candle, I just take the napkin and put it in the sink. No slap, no yelling. Lucy, that's not such a good idea. I know, Bob. And I think how I would have treated my daughter 40 years ago, and I cringe. So the fact is, are you telling me that if there is a creator in the whole millennia, that he cares if you get your theology right about this person and that that's how you're saved? This is insanity, because essentially it means that we are saying that we're describing God's character as meaner and stupider than a jerk like me who was slapping his little girl and learned not to, and God has been around since the beginning of the Big Bang and still hasn't learned to be nice to anybody. This is insanity.
Certainty kills. And in one of my books, I have a line, I think it's in Sex, Mom, and God, that nobody ever blew up an abortion clinic or a mosque after yelling, but I could be wrong. That just doesn't happen. Well, similarly, the spirit that powered this hand to slap a little defenseless 3-year-old when she annoyed me was partly youth and experience and just being a bastard, okay? But part of it was a theological certainty that painted me as the dominant male in a household that had to discipline and drive the truth into children and keep them sheltered and make sure my wife did the right thing, and we all had to toe the line. And so the arc away from that kind of certainty has also been an arc toward mercy and compassion. Dealt with some of my demons and got out of a profession I really hated, which was the God business, from a hard right position, and had let go of this idea that I had some special divine wisdom. I had this Bible that gave me the role of what a father and a man is, and in that Bible there's stories about little girls being stoned to death in the court of their father because they lost their virginity. And it's a mean book when it comes to how to treat women, and this bleeds into the way women get treated, and it certainly bleeds into fatherhood. And so today, literally, it breaks my heart when I read some evangelical literature sometimes, a couple bestsellers actually, on, quote, how to raise children, and it involves spanking and hitting and beating kids when they're little with coat hangers and all the rest of this, as if somehow, we've got to beat people into the truth. And even for the nonviolent evangelical parents who don't hit their kids and so forth, this idea that somehow you've been given this revealed position and you're right, and the whole world is wrong, and that kind of mean anger against gay people and whoever the other is that you're talking about, feminists, whatever, communists, Marxists, socialists, Democrats, black people, whatever that is, it really bleeds into a domestic meanness and bullying that I found in my own life. So, one of the reasons Lucy has a grandfather who's a hell of a better grandfather than he was a father is that I got older. But another reason is that I have really embraced an idea that I think is much more realized in mainstream churches, for one, and that is that paradox, uncertainty, is not the enemy. It's actually the blessing. It's when you know you're right that you're really mean to people, and not the other way around. You know, if you were looking for pieces of your journey where things made more sense after you got there than they did before, one of them is to not try to resolve paradox. And to me, that's been the heart of finding a little peace in my life. You know, here's a guy that MSNBC calls all the time to talk about what the crazy people on the religious right have done or will do, you know, but whose real interest is the fact that I hadn't been down to the Andy Warhol retrospective at the Metropolitan of Art yet. Okay, they're not thinking that's who they're talking to. I'm not telling them that I'm not interested in their subject because I got another agenda going here, which is I've got to sell a book. Otherwise, I don't have a room to play with Lucy in anymore. Or I can't buy another 18,000 pounds of concrete to mix up in my wheelbarrow and both stay in shape and build places so that Jeannie and I can rent the top floor and retire here and stay in our home because we can't afford to otherwise. You know, so I'm not talking about that stuff, and I'm just going down and doing what they want for a few minutes. Those are the sorts of experiences where in the old days I would be all anxious to tell my story. Don't they know who, you know, blah, 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 blah. And I'm doing it here because you're asking me and this is an interview and you've asked me. But in generally speaking, I have found peace in just, hey, you know, it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter whether everybody knows, you know, all these different facets and everything. Be thankful for the opportunity you've been given here. You know, it's like I remember when I used to hitchhike around Europe a lot. So sometimes I'd almost be pissed off with a guy when after an hour nobody stopped, he stops. It's like, you know, where have you been kind of thing. Or, hey, you know, this is a crappy car and now I'm sitting here with it smells like his wet dog and, you know, there's hair all over the seat. And then it's, you got to remind yourself, but hey, you know, he stopped. So I often think that, you know, in these media exposure things, it's like, you know, I'd rather be writing something different than what I write about on Huffington Post that makes it to the front page, which is always this sort of hard-edged political commentary. But this is the profession you've chosen, A, and B, at least they're publishing your stuff and putting it in front of people. You know, don't be so dainty, expecting it all delivered to you on a tea tray. That comes from being able to look at these contradictory experiences and life paths and have some peace in accepting paradox for what it is, which is just this is how life is. I guess the difference between me now and when I was younger is that I not only accept that, I actually revel in it. I love the theater of the absurd in my life. You know, I love the fact that you know, my interest is in art, and you know, I can tell you all about Lorenzo de Medici and Guglielmo and what happened with the Sforza family and the Pitti Palace and the bridge across, you know, to it, and how this connects with what was going on with the Doge of Venice and all that. Why? Because that was Francis Schaeffer's true interest. While people were coming over from these stupid institutions like Calvin College or Wheaton or all these places so concerned about theology, what he really wanted to do is take them all to Italy and look at art, but they made him talk about Jesus because that's how he earned his living. Well, you know, his son continues the tradition and paints less than he wants to and talks about politics when I'm really interested in the Medici family. So basically you just say, okay, I'll live with that. You know, my interests are not what interests other people very much when it comes to what actually makes my heart beat a little faster. So I'll go to the next tier because at least that works and they'll bring me in to talk about that. You know, sometimes I write things that's crap and not good, and then you can attack the ideas or I'm not logical, but a lot of the time when I'm, quote, answered by the evangelical establishment, it's just to attack me. I don't answer the reviews because life's too short, but while I read the first paragraph before I get too angry and then slam the thing shut, I just keep to myself, you know, my question is, but was it true? Forget my tone or that I'm a jerk or that, you know, I'm angry. Was it true? And that's what that's never, you know, this cheap shot, well, he was angry or he's this or he's reacting or it's not right or he's not spiritual enough or he's committed the son of Noah and looked upon his father's nakedness because he wrote a book and it wasn't nice, you know, and all this. The point is, was it true? Or is he a liar? And if I'm a liar, show me where I lied. But if it's true, stop pissing and moaning about the tone and deal with it. And that's what I say to myself. And then I write nice emails saying, I think you have a point. I'm sure I can learn something.
Thank you for your note.
Hey, listen, if there's anything we're schooled in the evangelical world, it's false humility, okay? I know how to do that. Whereas in my evangelical background, paradox was the enemy, because if you didn't have the answers, chapter and verse, then somehow that translated into not being able to give answers to other people, and you had this black and white paradigm of saved and lost. And so your job was to make sure they were all like you, which of course was in the end to make them as miserable as you were. There's a time in people's lives when they arrive at a period of doubt, and they can go one of two ways. They can reinforce their certainties and then become very harsh because they've never really gotten answers to the questions for a simple reason: there are none. Or they can open themselves to the questions and not be pastors of megachurches, part of the big God business where you get a paycheck and some standing. When you look at some of the fury directed against people who depart from whatever it is, like somebody writes a book saying they don't believe in hell anymore, they question this or whatever, what's reserved for those people is a kind of a scorn and personality attack, character assassination. That really only belongs to people who are very insecure in their own views, because there'd be no reason to react that way. There are a lot of people in the evangelical world who are in leadership positions of one sort or another and have such fear of questions on an intellectual level that they lash out, and or they themselves have become atheists long ago, even if they won't admit it. But the paycheck is there, and if they could only inherit that $10 million of money, that they'd need to live happily, they would be out of there like a heartbeat. Remembering, what flakes some of the people were that I knew well in the L'Abri community, who years later pontificate about how they don't like something that I'm doing, as if they've got some holier-than-thou stand, But I remember what they were doing with, back when they were working with my dad or whatever. And you have to make a choice and say, well, am I going to out a whole bunch of people and turn things into a vendetta? Or not, and I choose not to, not so much on principle, but just, hey, life's too short. Setting the record straight is not something that interests me, and it's not the direction I want to go in with my life. Jim Baker went to jail for whatever financial malfeasance, real or imagined. I don't know. It's not for me to judge. But there are abortion providers who were shot in the head somewhere, probably because of something Dad or I wrote by extension. So it's a toss-up. So that's where you just have to say, listen, even when it gets to Jim Baker not believing in the mercy of God because maybe he sold it so much as a product that he feels somehow if it's real he's not included because he mishandled it to that extent. Or to someone like me who actually has to answer for the murder of some abortion providers in a only just 2 or 3 degrees of separation, not even 6. Do we believe in a redemptive paradigm where Christ ended sacrifice, or do we believe in a retributive God where it's all about, I'm going to get you in the end? And if we do, then let's be honest and cut to the real big chase. That means that in the sum total picture of everything, Osama bin Laden, Hitler, Pol Pot, Mao Zedong, and or evangelical leaders that ripped off everybody around them in the name of God, will find redemption at some point. Deal with it. And if we can't deal with that, then we can't deal with the fact that we will claim mercy ourselves. We have a retributive sense of primate justice. We want to slap down everybody in our way, including people who do terrible things. Fine, if you believe that an Osama bin Laden or Hitler goes to hell, finally, let's just remember this, from the evangelical point of view of lost and saved, in or out, black and white, based on theology and correct belief, that little old lady and child who was gouged at Auschwitz went into the German fire and 10 seconds later was in hell because they hadn't accepted Jesus. That's the same, quote, justice. So, when you get to the insanity of Calvinism, which goes to the next step and says, and by the way, that little Jewish girl who's burning forever, she was created for that purpose. Right. Then I say, kill God. Then I say, I am his enemy. But I know I'm not, because I look into the eyes of my little Lucy, and what looks back at me is not a paradigm of retribution, but ultimate forgiveness. I have times like you probably when you get depressed. Maybe you don't, I do. All the time. And I was falling 6 days into one of these things, and times when you're depressed, you think about killing yourself. You understand people who do these things. You just don't for the family and people around you. And the fact of the matter is, you look around the world, it looks very dark. And I was having a moment like that in church, going up to receive the communion chalice. And I've taken Lucy to communion now since she was born, and so there's always this little weight on my hip, so I hardly notice her. And I was just lost in the moment, and she was 3 years old, so she was on my hip. So I'm waiting my turn, and I'm just thinking, and now I'm lost in a reverie of self-recrimination, missed opportunity, wasted years.
harshness, being mean to my wife, times I slap my children, whatever it is, all this, and like, what am I doing here? This is hopeless. I'm totally lost. Not God's judging me, just I'm lost. Forgetting that Lucy's right there. And I feel this little hand come out and just touch my cheek. And I open my eyes, having kind of forgotten where I was, and Lucy's looking right into my eyes. And she's only 3.5, but if I can put it this way, it was a grown-up look. Like, are you okay? And I was thinking to myself, I have just seen the face of God. And I looked up and I suddenly realized, I know why I'm in line for communion today. And it was nothing spiritual in the sense of theological, that this will save me. It's just like, I know what grace looks like now. It's a little child who doesn't even know, you know, your past, and is just taking you as you are in that moment and accepts you as you are. I'm just her ba. Well, guess what? I'm just God's child. And I am to God what Lucy is to me. And that little vision there was like, you're off the hook. Now, does that mean I believe in God all the time? Not at all. I'm a Christian atheist. I did that moment.
Oh, and I take my naps here on my terry cloth towel. For some unknown reason, I can't sleep during the day in a bed. Go figure. So I put on BBC World Service and or BBC 4. Apparently sleeping to English voices is easier for me. And I lie down here on the floor and stretch out and sleep. And Jeannie thinks I'm absolutely out of my mind, but I don't know why I can sleep on this crazy floor made out of a very hard hardwood ipe, by the way, which I put this decking in. Learned that you've got to pre-drill every single hole for a nail, which was a shock. So there was 3 weeks of work there instead of a day. And I nap there. And those naps are like 20 minutes long, and that's it. That's what I do in this room here.